Story title: The Night the Woods Came Alive. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. A few of us had planned to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, trading the relentless noise for the calming whispers of the wilderness. Our destination was a remote forest, miles away from the nearest town, where the stars shone brighter and the world felt a little more in tune with nature. Little did we know, that night would forever be etched in our memories as the most terrifying experience of our lives. We arrived at the campsite just before dusk. The forest was dense, the trees standing tall and proud like ancient guardians. Their branches intertwined, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Despite the foreboding atmosphere, we were excited, our spirits high as we set up our tents and built a fire. The crackling flames and the warmth of the fire brought a sense of comfort, a feeling that we were safe, surrounded by nature. As night fell, the forest seemed to change. The once soothing sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. We tried to shake off the unease by telling stories around the campfire, but there was a tension in the air that none of us could ignore. At around midnight, we heard it, a distant rustling, followed by a low, guttural growl. We all fell silent, straining to hear what it was. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was not the sound of an animal, at least not one I could identify. It was primal, ancient, and it sent a chill down my spine. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just the wind or some animal passing by, but deep down, we knew better. The growl grew louder, closer. Our fire, once bright and strong, seemed to dim as the sound approached, as if the very essence of the flames was being sucked away by whatever was out there. One of my friends, Tom, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the darkness, his footsteps crunching on the dried leaves. We watched as his light bobbed in the distance, then stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence once again. Then Tom screamed. It was a sound of pure terror, a primal cry that made our blood run cold. We rushed to where he had been, only to find his flashlight on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. Tom was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as we called out his name, but there was no response, only the haunting echo of our voices in the still night air. Fear gripped us as we realized we were not alone. The growling returned, this time surrounding us from all sides. Whatever it was toying with us, enjoying our fear. We huddled together, our eyes darting around the dark forest, trying to catch a glimpse of what was out there. Suddenly, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. Then the forest came alive. The trees seemed to move on their own, their branches twisting and contorting as if reaching out to us. Shadows danced in the periphery of our vision, dark shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. We ran. Panic took over, and we fled into the woods, not caring where we were going as long as we were getting away from whatever was hunting us. The forest, once a place of refuge, had become a nightmare, a maze of trees that seemed to close in on us, no matter which direction we turned. As we ran, I could feel something behind us, its presence a cold, heavy weight on my back. The air grew thick, almost tangible, as if the very atmosphere of the forest was trying to suffocate us. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running, driven by sheer terror. Finally, we stumbled upon a clearing, the moonlight shining down like a beacon of hope. We collapsed, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. For a moment, we thought we were safe. But then, from the darkness of the trees, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, followed by another and another. They were watching us, studying us. The growling returned, now louder and more menacing than ever before. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We were surrounded. In a desperate attempt to protect ourselves, we built another fire, gathering whatever we could find to keep the flames alive. The fire flickered weakly, as if struggling against the darkness that sought to extinguish it. The eyes in the woods grew closer, and the growling intensified, vibrating through the ground, through our very bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The eyes vanished, the growling ceased, and the forest fell silent once more. We were left sitting in the clearing, too terrified to move, too exhausted to think. We stayed there until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, bathing the forest in a warm golden glow. When we finally gathered the courage to return to our campsite, we found it destroyed. The tents were ripped apart, the food scattered, and the fire pit overturned. But there was no sign of Tom. We searched for hours, calling his name, but he was gone, swallowed by the forest. To this day, we never found out what happened to him or what hunted us that night. The forest remains a mystery, a place where nature and something far more sinister coexist. We left that place and never returned, but the memory of that night haunts us still. The night the woods came alive, and we learned that some places are better left untouched. Story title: The Endless Night. There's something about the woods at night that has always fascinated me, the way the trees seem to stretch endlessly into the darkness, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. But that fascination turned into sheer terror one fateful night when I learned that the woods can also be a place of unimaginable horror. It was late autumn, and a group of us decided to go camping one last time before winter set in. We chose a spot deep within Black Hollow Forest, a place known for its dense trees and eerie silence. The locals in the nearby town often warned travelers to avoid the area after dark, but we dismissed their tales as mere superstition. After all, we were seasoned campers, confident in our ability to handle anything the wilderness could throw at us. We set up camp just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and a thick fog began to roll in, wrapping the trees in a shroud of mist. The atmosphere was unsettling, but we brushed it off, huddling around the campfire for warmth and comfort. As the fire crackled and popped, we shared stories and laughed, the flickering flames dancing in our eyes. But the laughter gradually faded as we noticed something strange. The fog had thickened, enveloping our campsite completely. The world beyond the reach of our firelight had vanished into a wall of impenetrable gray. We were isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by the dense fog. An uneasy silence settled over us, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant hoot of an owl. But then, something else broke the silence. A soft, rhythmic sound, like footsteps, coming from just beyond the fog. We all had it, and our conversations died mid-sentence. The footsteps circled the campsite, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves underfoot. We strained our eyes, peering into the fog, but saw nothing. Just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped, leaving us in an oppressive silence once again. We exchanged nervous glances, but none of us wanted to admit that we were scared. Instead, we tried to rationalize what we'd heard, a deer, perhaps, or a wandering animal. But deep down, we all knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, the fog parted for a brief moment, and we saw them, figures standing at the edge of our campsite. They were tall, shadowy, and human-like, but there was something off about them. Their limbs were too long, their posture too stiff, and their faces were obscured by the darkness. They stood there, motionless, watching us. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, the figures melted back into the fog. The footsteps resumed, this time faster, more erratic, as if whatever was out there was becoming agitated. Fear gripped us, and we huddled closer to the fire, our eyes darting around the campsite, searching for any sign of movement. The footsteps continued to circle us, growing louder, closer. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, closing in on us, suffocating us. One of my friends, Jake, grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the fog, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The beam of light cut through the mist, revealing nothing but trees and empty space. But as he swept the light across the fog, something darted past the edge of the beam, a flash of movement that was too fast, too fluid to be human. Panic set in. We grabbed whatever we could use as weapons, branches, knives, anything that might protect us. The footsteps stopped again, but this time, a new sound filled the air, a low, guttural whisper. Unintelligible and haunting. It echoed through the trees, growing louder, more insistent. The whispers seemed to seep into our minds, filling us with a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was as if the forest itself was alive, speaking to us in a language we couldn't understand, but the message was clear. We were not welcome here. We couldn't stay there any longer. Abandoning our campsite, we fled into the woods, the fog swallowing us whole. The forest was a labyrinth of trees and shadows, every direction looking the same, but we ran anyway, desperate to escape the malevolent presence that stalked us. As we ran, the whispers followed us, growing louder, more chaotic. The figures reappeared, darting between the trees, always just out of reach, taunting us. The ground beneath our feet seemed to shift and change, leading us in circles, trapping us in an endless night. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The fog never lifted, and the darkness remained impenetrable. We were lost, disoriented, our minds fraying under the constant assault of the whispers and the figures in the fog. Finally, we stumbled upon a clearing, the moonlight filtering weakly through the fog. We collapsed, too exhausted to continue, our bodies shaking with fear and cold. The whispers faded, and the figures retreated, leaving us in an eerie silence once more. We waited there, huddled together, until the first light of dawn broke through the fog. The sunlight was weak, but it was enough to dispel the fog and the horrors of the night. We made our way back to the campsite, our steps slow and weary. When we arrived, we found our tents and belongings untouched, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. The memory of that night, the whispers, and the figures in the fog haunted us long after we left the woods. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced in Black Hollow Forest. Some nights, when the wind howls and the fog rolls in, I can still hear the whispers, feel the eyes watching me from the darkness. And I know, without a doubt, that the woods are not a place for the faint of heart. Story title: The Watchers in the Dark. It was supposed to be just another routine camping trip, nothing more than a few nights spent under the stars with some close friends, soaking in the serenity of nature. The chosen spot was a remote area deep within the Appalachian Mountains, far from the nearest trail or town. The isolation was part of the allure. No distractions, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting a golden glow over the towering pines. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. It felt like the perfect getaway, a chance to unplug and reconnect with the natural world. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for what we expected to be a peaceful evening. As night fell, we built a large fire, its flames licking the cool night air. The stars above were brilliant, untainted by light pollution, and the forest around us was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. We ate, laughed, and told stories, feeling completely at ease in our secluded paradise. It wasn't until the fire began to die down that we first noticed it, a pair of glowing eyes just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, we thought it was a deer or some other curious animal, drawn by the smell of our food. But then, another set of eyes appeared, and another, until there were at least half a dozen pairs of eyes reflecting the dying firelight, watching us intently from the darkness. The forest had fallen eerily silent. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, had ceased entirely. We felt the weight of their gaze, an unnatural stillness that sent a shiver down our spines. Someone threw a log onto the fire, and the sudden flare of light caused the eyes to blink out of sight, but only for a moment. They reappeared just as quickly, closer this time, as if testing the boundaries of the fire's protection. We were unnerved, but not yet frightened. We tried to rationalize it. Wild animals, maybe even wolves, though none of us had ever seen so many at once. But as the fire continued to burn down, revealing the full scope of the darkness around us, we realized something was very wrong. The eyes weren't moving like animals. They were too synchronized, too deliberate, almost as if they were being directed by something unseen. Someone suggested we move to our tents and try to sleep, but the thought of leaving the fire's warmth and light was unbearable. Instead, we stoked the fire higher, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. But the eyes didn't retreat. If anything, they seemed emboldened, edging closer with every passing minute. Then came the whispering. It started as a low murmur, just on the edge of hearing, a sound so faint we weren't sure if it was real or just our imaginations. But it grew louder, more distinct, a soft chorus of voices speaking in a language none of us could understand. The whispers seemed to come from all around us, blending with the night air, as if the forest itself was speaking to us. We huddled closer together, our eyes darting from the fire to the darkness beyond. The whispers were hypnotic, pulling at our minds, making it hard to think clearly. They were laced with an undercurrent of malice, a threat that we couldn't quite grasp but felt deep in our bones. Just when we thought the night couldn't get any worse, the eyes began to move. They darted from tree to tree, impossibly fast, circling us in a way that no animal could. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air grew thick with tension. The fire, no matter how much wood we fed it, seemed to shrink in the presence of those eyes and the voices in the dark. One of us, driven by fear or madness, grabbed a burning branch from the fire and threw it into the woods, hoping to scare whatever it was away. The branch asked through the air, landing with a sizzle as the flame met the damp earth. For a moment there was silence, and we thought it might have worked. But then the forest exploded with sound. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and inhuman, echoing through the trees. The eyes multiplied, hundreds of them now, all around us, darting and flashing in the darkness. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble as if the very earth was responding to the cries of the forest. Panic set in. We knew we had to get out of there, but the way back to the car was through the very woods where those things were hiding. Staying by the fire felt like a death sentence, but leaving meant running straight into whatever was out there. It was a lose-lose situation, but the instinct to survive pushed us to make a break for it. We grabbed our flashlights, doused the fire to prevent it from spreading, and ran. The woods closed in around us, the darkness almost tangible, pressing against our skin like a cold, wet blanket. The whispers followed us, growing louder, almost mocking in their tone. The eyes were everywhere, flickering in the beams of our flashlights, always just out of reach. Branches clawed at our clothes, the underbrush tripped us up, but we kept running, driven by sheer terror. The car seemed miles away, every step taking us deeper into the nightmare. The whispers had become a roar, a cacophony of voices blending together in a chaotic symphony of fear. Finally, we broke through the tree line and saw the car, parked just where we had left it. We scrambled inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. As the headlights pierced the darkness, we saw them, figures standing at the edge of the woods, their bodies tall and thin, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched as we sped away, the tires kicking up gravel in our haste to escape. The whispers faded as we left the forest behind, but the memory of them, and of those eyes, would stay with us forever. We never returned to that place, and to this day, we don't talk about what we saw in the woods that night. The others might have tried to forget, but I can't. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, soft and distant, as if they're calling to me, waiting for me to return to the darkness where they belong. Story title: The Cabin in the Forgotten Woods. There's a part of the country, tucked away in the farthest reaches of the mountains, where the woods are so dense and ancient that even the locals avoid them. They call it the Forgotten Woods, a place where sunlight barely penetrates the thick canopy of twisted, gnarled trees and where the ground is covered in a perpetual carpet of moss and fallen leaves. The stories say that these woods have a life of their own, that those who venture too deep are never seen again. But like many, I was drawn to the mystery, to the challenge of proving the legends wrong. I was on a solo hiking trip, something I often did to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. The map showed a small, abandoned cabin deep within the Forgotten Woods, a perfect destination for an overnight stay. The cabin was rumored to be over 100 years old, built by settlers who had long since disappeared, leaving the structure to rot and decay. The idea of spending a night in such a place thrilled me. I set out early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the mountains. The hike through the forest was challenging, the trails barely visible beneath the undergrowth. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. As I ventured deeper, the trees grew taller, their trunks wider and the light dimmer. It felt as though I was walking into another world, a place untouched by time. By late afternoon, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined, a single-room structure with a sagging roof and walls covered in moss. The windows were broken, the door hanging on one rusted hinge. It looked as though it could collapse at any moment, but it had a certain charm, a reminder of a bygone era. I set up my sleeping bag inside, started a small fire in the old stone fireplace, and settled in for the night. As the sun set, the forest outside grew darker, the shadows lengthening and merging into a solid wall of black. The only light came from the fire, its flickering flames casting eerie shapes on the walls of the cabin. I tried to relax, but there was something about the place that made it impossible. The air felt heavy, as if it were pressing down on me, and the silence was unnerving. There were no night sounds, no insects chirping, no owls hooting, just an endless, suffocating quiet. It wasn't long before I started hearing the noises. At first, it was just a soft tapping, like something was gently knocking on the outside of the cabin. I dismissed it as branches brushing against the wood, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get in. I stood up, peering out through the broken windows, but there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing against the glass. Then the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but they grew louder, more distinct, filling the cabin with a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The voices spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a harsh, guttural whisper that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, the very wood groaning with the weight of the words. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, just the creaking of an old, abandoned cabin. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, almost angry. The tapping turned into banging, heavy blows that shook the cabin, rattling the windows and door. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, but the beam of light revealed nothing, just the dense forest, silent and still. Fear gripped me, a cold, paralyzing fear that I had never felt before. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. There was something out there, something that didn't want me in its woods, in its cabin. The air inside the cabin grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the whispers turned into screams. Horrible, distorted screams that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. The banging on the walls became violent, the door shaking on its hinges as if it were about to be torn off. I could hear footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate, circling the cabin, accompanied by low growls and snarls. It was as if the forest had come alive, and it was furious that I had disturbed its slumber. I couldn't stay there any longer. Grabbing my gear, I bolted for the door, pushing it open and running into the darkness. The forest was a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes, every tree looking the same, every direction leading nowhere. The screams followed me, growing louder, more desperate, as if whatever was in the cabin was chasing me, trying to drag me back into the darkness. I ran blindly through the woods, branches clawing at my clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, the trees closing in on me, but I kept running, driven by sheer terror. The whispers and screams surrounded me, filling my ears, my mind, until I thought I would go mad. Hours seemed to pass before I finally stumbled out of the forest, collapsing on the side of a dirt road. The night was still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. The forest behind me was silent, the trees standing tall and still as if nothing had happened. I never went back to those woods, and I never told anyone what happened that night. The forgotten woods are just that, forgotten, lost to time and memory. But I can never forget the feeling of being watched, the sense that something in those woods knew I was there and wanted me gone. Some places, I've learned, are better left undisturbed, their secrets hidden in the darkness where they belong. Story title: The Haunting of Cedar Hollow. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place that didn't appear on most maps, a forgotten patch of wilderness tucked away in the Appalachian foothills. The locals had long abandoned it, leaving only rumors and ghost stories in their wake. The area had a reputation for being cursed, a place where strange things happened and people vanished without a trace. Naturally, this made it the perfect destination for an adventure. It was a chilly autumn weekend when we decided to visit Cedar Hollow. My friends and I had heard the stories, tales of lost hikers, eerie lights in the woods, and an old, abandoned church where no one dared to enter. We were skeptics, though, convinced that the tales were nothing more than local lore, meant to scare off curious visitors. But as we drove deeper into the hollow, the road narrowing to a barely visible trail, an uneasy silence fell over us. The trees grew denser as we approached the heart of the hollow, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath our tires. Finally, we reached our destination, a small clearing where the remains of the old church still stood. The church was nothing more than a crumbling stone structure, its roof long gone, the walls covered in ivy. The graveyard beside it was overgrown, the headstones worn and tilted, some half buried in the ground. The place had a somber, almost oppressive atmosphere, as if the very land itself was heavy with sorrow and despair. But we were here for an adventure, and nothing was going to scare us off. We set up camp a short distance from the church, making sure to stay within sight of the clearing. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and a thick fog rolled in, wrapping around the trees and creeping across the ground like a living thing. The fire we built struggled to stay lit, the flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. That's when we first noticed the lights. At first, they were faint, barely visible through the fog, small, glowing orbs that hovered just above the ground. We watched in silence as the lights began to move, drifting slowly through the graveyard and around the church. They were mesmerizing, almost beautiful in their ghostly glow, but there was something unsettling about them. They moved with purpose, as if they were searching for something or someone. One of my friends, Mike, decided to investigate. Grabbing his flashlight, he ventured into the fog, heading toward the lights. We watched as his figure grew smaller and smaller, eventually swallowed by the mist. For a long time, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then suddenly, the lights flared brightly, and we heard Mike scream. We jumped up, calling his name, but there was no response. The lights darted around in the fog, faster now, erratic. Without thinking, we grabbed our flashlights and ran after him, but the fog was so thick that we could barely see a few feet in front of us. The lights seemed to dance just out of reach, leading us deeper into the graveyard. As we moved closer to the church, the air grew colder, and a feeling of dread settled over us. The lights were now circling the church, their glow casting long shadows on the crumbling stone walls. We could hear something, whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from all around us. It was as if the very walls of the church were alive, speaking to us in a language we couldn't understand. The church door, which we had assumed was sealed shut, creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, almost pleading. We hesitated at the threshold, but then we heard Mike's voice, faint and desperate, calling for help from within. We had no choice. We entered the church, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sour. The floor was covered in debris, broken pews, shattered glass, and piles of leaves that had blown in over the years. But there was no sign of Mike. As we moved deeper into the church, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging us into complete darkness. The whispers turned into wails, high-pitched, mournful cries that echoed through the stone walls. The lights appeared again, this time inside the church, circling us, closing in. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. We shouted for Mike, but all we heard were those terrible wails and the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from all around us. The lights grew brighter, their glow almost blinding, and then we saw them, figures in the dark, moving toward us. They were barely human, their forms twisted and shadowy, their faces obscured by the darkness. They reached out with long, bony fingers, their touch cold and painful. We backed away, trying to find a way out, but the figures blocked our path, herding us toward the altar at the front of the church. There, lying on the cold stone floor, was Mike. His eyes were wide with terror, his skin pale and clammy. He was alive, but barely. He muttered something, his voice weak, but we couldn't make out the words. The figures closed in, their whispers now a cacophony of voices that filled our heads, drowning out all thought. In a final act of desperation, we grabbed Mike and made a run for it, charging through the figures and toward the door. It flew open as we approached, and we burst out into the foggy night, the cold air hitting us like a slap in the face. The lights followed us for a moment, but then retreated back into the church as if bound to that cursed place. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. The fog lifted as we sped away, revealing the church and graveyard behind us, now quiet and still. Mike was in shock, unable to speak, his eyes filled with a terror that none of us could understand. We never spoke about that night again, and we vowed never to return to Cedar Hollow. The place had taken something from us. Our peace of mind, our sense of safety. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, the sound of those whispers echoing in my mind. I don't know what we encountered in that church, but I do know one thing. Some places are forgotten for a reason, and Cedar Hollow is a place best left alone. Story title: The Night the Trees Watched. Then we'd heard it, a low, groaning sound like the creak of an old wooden door being opened. It seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the trees. We fell silent, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound was followed by a series of sharp, cracking noises, like branches snapping under the weight of something heavy. What was that? One of my friends whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. None of us answered. We were all listening, straining our ears for any sign of movement, but the forest had returned to its eerie silence. Just as we began to relax, thinking it was nothing more than the natural sounds of the woods, we noticed something strange. The trees at the edge of the clearing, once standing tall and still, seemed to have shifted. Their branches, which had previously pointed skyward, now appeared to be leaning toward us, as if they were reaching out, encircling us. The fire flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the trunks, and that's when I saw it, eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, peering out from between the twisted branches. They weren't the eyes of animals, though. They were too large, too human-like. And they were all fixed on us. The oppressive feeling grew stronger, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches creaking and groaning as they bent and twisted in ways that defied nature. The eyes in the dark watched us intently, unblinking, as if studying us, waiting. One of my friends, Jake, stood up, his voice shaky as he tried to sound brave. "It's just our imagination, guys. The firelight is playing tricks on us." But even as he said it, I could hear the doubt in his voice. We all could. Then the wind picked up, a cold, biting wind that seemed to come out of nowhere. It whipped through the clearing, sending sparks from the fire flying into the night. The trees swayed violently, their branches creaking and snapping, but the eyes remained steady, unblinking. The wind carried with it a sound, a low, whispering murmur that seemed to come from the trees themselves. It was like the forest was speaking, the leaves rustling in a language we couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, becoming more frantic, more desperate. Panic set in. We grabbed our flashlights, pointing them into the darkness, trying to see what was out there, but the beams of light only seemed to deepen the shadows. The eyes in the trees blinked out of sight, only to reappear in different places, closer now, surrounding us. "Let's get out of here," someone said, and without another word, we scrambled to put out the fire, stamping it down until only smoldering embers remained. The darkness rushed in, and we fumbled with our gear, our hands shaking with fear. But as we turned to leave the clearing, the path we had come in on was gone. The trees had closed in, their branches intertwining to form an impenetrable wall. We were trapped. Desperation took over as we tried to find another way out, but every direction led us deeper into the grove. The trees seemed to move, their roots shifting underfoot, tripping us up, guiding us in circles. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent, filling our minds with a sense of dread and despair. Then, the ground beneath us began to tremble. It started as a faint vibration, but quickly grew stronger, shaking the earth and the trees. We stumbled, falling to the ground as the forest seemed to come alive around us. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches twisting and turning, reaching out like skeletal fingers. The eyes reappeared, closer than ever, glowing brighter, watching us with a malevolent intensity. The whispers turned into voices, harsh, guttural voices that seemed to speak directly into our minds, filling our heads with images of darkness, of ancient, forgotten things that should never be disturbed. We were paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to think. The forest had us in its grip, and there was no escape. The trees closed in, the branches entwining around us, pulling us down into the cold, damp earth. Just when it felt like all hope was lost, a blinding light cut through the darkness. It was like a flash of lightning, illuminating the entire grove in a brilliant white light. The trees recoiled, their branches snapping back as if burned by the light. The eyes blinked out of existence, and the whispers ceased. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us in the dim glow of dawn. The path was back, clear and unobstructed, leading us out of the Watcher's grove. We didn't hesitate. We grabbed our gear and ran, not stopping until we were miles away from that cursed place. We never spoke of that night again, and none of us ever returned to the Watcher's Grove. But I'll never forget those eyes, or the feeling that something ancient and malevolent lies within those woods, watching, waiting for the next foolhardy group to venture too deep into its domain. The stories were true. The Watcher's Grove is a place best left alone, where the trees are alive, and they are always watching. Story title: The Night of the Unseen. There's a remote part of the Pacific Northwest that few people dare to venture into. The dense, rain-soaked forests have a reputation for being unforgiving, swallowing up anyone who isn't prepared for the rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. The locals tell tales of strange happenings in those woods, lights in the sky, unnatural sounds, and people who go missing without a trace. But as an experienced outdoorsman, I dismissed those stories as just that, stories. It was early October when I decided to take a solo trip into the heart of those woods. I was looking for a challenge, a chance to test my skills and enjoy the solitude that only nature can offer. I packed my gear, made sure to have enough supplies for a few days, and set off early in the morning. The hike-in was tough, but nothing I couldn't handle. The forest was beautiful in its own wild way, with towering trees, thick underbrush, and a constant mist that hung in the air like a veil. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek where I decided to set up camp. The ground was soft and covered in moss, and the sound of the water trickling over rocks was soothing. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. As dusk fell, the forest around me grew quiet, eerily quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed to fade away, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't think much of it at first. The isolation was part of the experience after all. But as the night deepened, I began to feel uneasy. The darkness in these woods was different, thicker, more oppressive. My campfire, which should have provided comfort, seemed small and insignificant against the vast, consuming blackness that surrounded me. Around midnight, the silence was shattered by a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, a sound that vibrated through the ground and up into my bones. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear where it was coming from. But just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped, leaving me in an even more unsettling silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the earth settling, or perhaps the distant call of some large animal. But as I sat there by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt eyes on me, watching from the shadows just beyond the firelight. But when I turned my flashlight on the surrounding trees, there was nothing there, just the silent, unmoving forest. Then the whispers began. At first they were so faint that I thought they were just the wind moving through the trees. But they grew louder, more distinct, until I could make out words. No, not words, but something that felt like communication, something speaking directly into my mind. The whispers were strange, foreign, like a language I had never heard, but somehow understood on an instinctual level. The air grew colder, and the fire started to sputter, its flames shrinking as if being drained of energy. The whispers surrounded me, coming from all directions, circling closer and closer. I stood up, my nerves on edge, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing, no one, just the impenetrable darkness. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging me into total darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I finally turned it on, the beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing. The clearing was empty, the trees standing tall and silent as they had been before. But the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, urgent, pressing against my mind, filling me with a sense of dread and despair. I could feel something moving in the darkness, something just out of sight, circling me, closing in. I grabbed my gear and decided to leave. The forest was no longer a place of peace and solitude. It had become something sinister, something alive with a presence that I could feel but not see. I tried to find the trail back, but the path seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't recognize. The trees loomed over me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little light there was from the crescent moon. The whispers became voices, low, guttural, and filled with malice. They spoke of things I couldn't fully understand but knew I should fear. My heart raced as I pushed forward, trying to find my way out, but the forest seemed to close in on me, guiding me deeper into its depths. Then I saw them, shadows moving between the trees, flickering in and out of existence. They were humanoid but twisted, distorted, their forms constantly shifting as if they were made of smoke or mist. They darted through the forest with unnatural speed, appearing in the corners of my vision, then vanishing before I could fully register them. The fear that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind erupted into full-blown terror. I started to run, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from whatever was out there. The forest seemed to warp around me, the trees twisting and turning, the path disappearing beneath my feet. The voices followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were inside my head, urging me to stop, to give in. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled out of the trees and onto a rocky slope. The sky above was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, and the voices, the shadows, all of it stopped as if cut off by an invisible barrier. I collapsed, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When I finally made it back to civilization, I was a shell of my former self. I couldn't explain what had happened in those woods, and to this day I still can't. But I know that something lives in those forests, something ancient and unseen, something that preys on those who wander too far into its domain. I've never returned to the Pacific Northwest, and I never will. Some places are meant to remain untouched, left to the darkness and the things that dwell within it. Story title: The Endless Night in Ravenwood Forest. Ravenwood Forest had always been shrouded in mystery. Located on the outskirts of a small town, it was a place where few dared to go. The trees were taller, older, and thicker than in any other forest I'd seen, their branches twisting together to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The locals spoke of the forest with a mix of fear and reverence, warning of strange occurrences, and the eerie sense that time itself behaved differently within its boundaries. But to me, that sounded like the perfect setting for an unforgettable camping trip. I convinced my two best friends, Alex and Sarah, to join me on what I promised would be a weekend of adventure. We packed our gear, eager to explore the untouched wilderness, and set off early on a crisp autumn morning. The path into the forest was narrow and overgrown, clearly unused for years, and as we ventured deeper, the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees became. It was as if the forest was closing in around us, the branches overhead growing so dense that the sunlight could barely penetrate the canopy. By the time we reached what we assumed was the heart of the forest, it was as dark as twilight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. We found a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, their gnarled roots twisting out of the ground like the fingers of some giant creature. It was the perfect spot to set up camp, or so we thought. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and settled in for what we expected to be a night of laughter and ghost stories. But as dusk fell, an unsettling stillness descended on the forest. The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, the distant hoot of an owl, were absent. The only sound was the crackling of our campfire, which seemed to shrink and sputter as the darkness deepened. The air grew cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year, and a thick fog began to roll in, clinging to the ground like a shroud. We tried to brush off the growing sense of unease, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, we'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of our eyes, but when we turned to look, there was nothing, just the shadows cast by the firelight. It was Sarah who first noticed the strange phenomenon. "Look at the trees," she whispered, her voice trembling. We turned our attention to the trees surrounding the clearing. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then we saw it. The branches were slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving. Not swaying in the wind, but bending, twisting, as if reaching toward us. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or our imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The trees were alive, watching us, encircling us. "We should leave," Alex said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." We agreed, but as we began to pack up our gear, the fog thickened, growing so dense that we could barely see each other, let alone the path out of the forest. The air was heavy, oppressive, and it became harder to breathe with each passing moment. Then the whispers started. At first, They were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all around us. But as we stood there, frozen with fear, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't like any language I'd ever heard, more like the sound of the wind through the trees, but with a sinister, almost mocking tone. Panic set in. We grabbed our flashlights and tried to find the path, but the beams of light barely cut through the fog. The forest seemed to shift around us, the trees moving closer, their branches reaching out like claws. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more frantic, filling our heads with a sense of dread and despair. We stumbled through the woods, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves and moss that covered the ground. The path, which had been clear when we arrived, was now gone, replaced by an endless maze of twisted trees and dense underbrush. No matter which direction we turned, we found ourselves back in the same clearing, the fire now nothing more than a smoldering pile of embers. The whispers turned into voices, low, guttural voices that spoke of things too horrible to comprehend. They called our names, taunting us, daring us to venture deeper into the forest. The fog seemed to pulse with each word, tightening around us like a noose. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, it was impossible to tell. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that cursed place, each second dragging on for an eternity. We were lost, disoriented, our minds fraying under the constant assault of the voices and the oppressive darkness. Then, without warning, the fog parted, revealing a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch forever. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. The figure raised one long skeletal arm and pointed at us. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on my ears, making my head throb. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching, waiting. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, bolting through the forest in a blind panic, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. The trees clawed at us, their branches tearing at our clothes and skin, but we didn't stop. The whispers returned, louder now, angry, as if the forest itself was furious that we were trying to escape. Finally, we broke through the tree line and stumbled into a clearing bathed in the soft light of dawn. The fog was gone, and the forest, though still dark and foreboding, had returned to something resembling normalcy. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where our car was parked. We drove away in silence, the events of the night playing over and over in our minds. We never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. The memory of that night in Ravenwood Forest haunts me to this day, the whispers, the moving trees, and that tall, shadowy figure that watched us with an unnatural, malevolent intelligence. I've never gone back to those woods, and I never will. Ravenwood Forest is a place where the boundaries between the natural world and something far darker blur, where the trees are alive with a presence that defies explanation. Whatever it is that lives in those woods, it doesn't want to be disturbed. And I have no intention of ever challenging it again. Story title: The Night the Woods Echoed. There's a stretch of forest in the northeastern part of the country known only as Echo's End. Few people venture there, and those who do rarely speak of what they find. The trees there are ancient, with trunks so wide that it would take several people to encircle them. The forest is unnaturally quiet, with no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, only the unsettling silence that seems to press in from all sides. Local legends tell of strange echoes that aren't mere reflections of sound, but are something far more sinister. I first heard about Echo's End from an old friend, Kevin, who was always drawn to the strange and unexplained. He convinced me and another friend, Liz, to join him on a weekend camping trip into the heart of the forest. We were curious, eager to debunk the myths and prove that the stories were nothing more than old wives' tales. We arrived at the edge of the forest just before dusk. The trees loomed over us, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers, blocking out the fading light. The air was cool and damp, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves that crunched softly underfoot. We set off into the forest, following a barely visible trail that wound its way through the dense undergrowth. As we walked, the silence became more oppressive. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as if the forest itself was absorbing noise, leaving only the faintest echoes of our footsteps and hushed voices. The deeper we went, the more the trail seemed to disappear, until we were left to navigate by instinct alone. By the time we found a suitable spot to set up camp, night had fallen and the darkness was absolute. We built a fire, its flickering flames casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. The silence weighed heavily on us, stifling any attempt at conversation. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted, as if the forest was swallowing the sound. As we sat around the fire, trying to shake off the eerie atmosphere, Kevin suggested we test the legend of the echoes. With a grin, he stood up and cupped his hands around his mouth, shouting into the darkness, "Hello." The word hung in the air for a moment, then came back to us, distorted and faint, as if traveling through a great distance before reaching our ears. But something about the echo was wrong. It wasn't just the distortion, it was the tone, the pitch. It didn't sound like Kevin's voice at all. It was lower, more guttural, almost as if someone, or something, was mimicking him. Liz and I exchanged uneasy glances, but Kevin just laughed it off. "See? Just an echo," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. We tried to push the incident from our minds and settled in for the night. But as the hours passed, the forest seemed to come alive with strange, almost imperceptible sounds. The echoes returned, but they weren't ours. They were distant at first, snatches of conversation, laughter, and footsteps, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, closer, until it sounded as if someone else was moving through the woods, just beyond the light of our fire. At one point, we heard what sounded like Liz's voice calling out from the darkness, even though she was sitting right beside us. The echo was identical to her voice, but there was something off about it, a hollow, mocking quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Kevin, ever the skeptic, decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the trees, following the sound of the echo. We watched the beam of his flashlight bobbing through the forest until it disappeared from sight. For a long time, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the oppressive silence. Then suddenly, we heard Kevin's voice calling out to us from the darkness. "Liz, Matt, come here. You have to see this." The voice sounded strange, faint and echoey, as if it was coming from far away. But the odd thing was that it seemed to be coming from all directions at once, bouncing off the trees and surrounding us. Liz and I stood up, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we tried to locate the source of the sound. We called out to Kevin, but there was no response, only the eerie echo of his voice, repeating our names over and over again, growing fainter with each repetition. Panic set in as we realized that we couldn't find the way back to our campsite. The trees all looked the same, and the path we had taken was nowhere to be found. The echoes continued, growing more distorted, more menacing, until they were nothing but a cacophony of voices, overlapping and blending together in a maddening chorus. We stumbled through the forest, desperate to find Kevin, but the echoes seemed to lead us in circles, disorienting us further. Every time we thought we were getting closer, the voices would shift, moving deeper into the woods, drawing us farther away from our campsite. Story title: The Night of the Shadow Beasts. There's a remote forest in the deep south that locals have long avoided. They call it Devil's Hollow, a name whispered with a mix of fear and reverence. The stories about that place are as old as the town itself. They speak of shadowy figures that roam the woods, strange lights that appear without warning, and an overwhelming sense of dread that suffocates anyone who dares to enter after dark. To most, these tales were enough to keep them away. But for me and my friends, it was a challenge we couldn't resist. We were a group of 5, myself, Jake, Emily, Marcus, and Laura. We'd spent years exploring abandoned places, testing the boundaries of what we believed was real. Devil's Hollow was the next on our list, a place we all agreed would be our ultimate test of courage. We set out on a cold November evening, the sun already sinking below the horizon as we drove toward the forest. The road was rough, barely more than a dirt path winding through the thick woods. The deeper we went, the more the trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the remaining light. By the time we reached the entrance to the hollow, night had fully fallen, and the only light came from our flashlights. The entrance was nothing more than a gap in the trees, barely wide enough for our car to squeeze through. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As soon as we stepped out of the car, an unsettling silence descended on us. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves in the wind, were absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Undeterred, we grabbed our gear and headed into the hollow. The path was narrow, lined with ancient trees whose bark was dark and cracked like the skin of something long dead. As we walked, the temperature dropped sharply, our breath fogging in the cold air. The further we went, the more oppressive the darkness became, our flashlights barely piercing the blackness that surrounded us. After what felt like hours of walking, we found a small clearing and decided to set up camp. We built a fire, the flames struggling to stay lit in the damp, cold air. The light from the fire cast long, flickering shadows on the trees around us, and for a moment we felt a bit of relief. But that relief was short-lived. It started with a low, almost imperceptible hum. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but as it grew louder, we realized it was something else, something unnatural. The sound seemed to come from all around us, vibrating through the ground and up into our bones. It was a deep, resonant hum, like the sound of a massive engine revving up in the distance. We exchanged nervous glances, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit we were scared. We tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire and our conversations, but the hum persisted, growing louder, more intense, until it was all we could hear. Then, without warning, the fire went out, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic set in. We fumbled for our flashlights, the beams flickering weakly in the thick darkness. But before we could react, the shadows around us began to move. At first it was subtle, a slight shift in the darkness at the edge of the clearing. But then the shadows started to take shape, solidifying into tall, menacing figures that loomed over us. They were massive, easily twice the height of a man, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly far. Their bodies were blacker than the night itself, absorbing the light from our flashlights. The only features we could make out were their eyes, glowing, hollow orbs that shone with a dull, malevolent light. We stood frozen, too terrified to move, as the shadow beasts circled our camp. They moved silently, their limbs twisting and contorting as they glided through the trees. The hum grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the beasts themselves. Jake was the first to break. He turned and ran, bolting through the trees without a second thought. The rest of us followed, our hearts pounding in our chests, adrenaline surging through our veins. The shadow beasts moved with us, matching our pace effortlessly, their eyes glowing brighter as they closed in. The forest around us became a blur of darkness and twisted branches as we ran, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The path we had taken to reach the clearing was gone, replaced by an endless maze of trees that seemed to shift and change with every step. No matter which way we turned, the shadow beasts were there, herding us deeper into the hollow. It was Emily who fell first. She tripped over a root and went down hard, the breath knocked out of her. Before any of us could reach her, one of the beasts descended upon her, its long limbs wrapping around her like a shroud. Her scream echoed through the forest, but it was cut short as the darkness swallowed her whole. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The beasts were right behind us, their growls now a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. The trees blurred past us as we ran, our legs burning with the effort, but it felt like we were moving in slow motion, as if the very air around us was thickening, slowing us down. Marcus was next. He veered off the path, trying to find a way around the beasts, but they were faster. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, pulled into the darkness with a final desperate cry. It was just Laura and me now, and we were losing hope. The path seemed endless, the shadow beasts relentless. We could hear their growls all around us, feel their presence closing in, but we couldn't see them anymore. The darkness was too thick, too complete. Finally, we'd burst out of the trees and into another clearing, except this one wasn't like the last. There was no grass, no leaves, just bare, cold earth that stretched out in all directions. And in the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching up to the sky like the fingers of some great skeletal hand. The shadow beasts were waiting for us. They emerged from the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on us, their growls low and menacing. We were cornered, with nowhere left to run. Laura and I backed up against the tree, our backs pressed against the rough bark. The beasts closed in, their limbs stretching out toward us, their growls vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. In that moment, something strange happened. The ancient tree behind us began to hum, a low, resonant sound that matched the frequency of the beasts. The air around us vibrated, and the beasts hesitated, their growls faltering. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it was all we could hear. The ground shook, and the tree's roots began to move, twisting and writhing like snakes. The beasts backed away, their eyes dimming, their forms flickering. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the tree's roots shot out, wrapping around the beasts and pulling them into the earth. The beasts struggled, their growls turning into shrieks as the roots tightened, dragging them down into the ground. One by one, they disappeared, swallowed by the earth until there was nothing left but silence. Laura and I stood there, too stunned to move, as the ground settled and the hum faded away. The ancient tree, its roots now still, loomed over us, silent and ominous. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran, not stopping until we were back at the entrance to Devil's Hollow. We never spoke about that night again, and we never returned to the hollow. Emily and Marcus were never found, their disappearances chalked up to a tragic accident. But Laura and I knew the truth. We had encountered something ancient, something that lived in those woods, and we had barely escaped with our lives. Devil's Hollow remains a place of legend, a dark, forbidden forest where shadow beasts roam and ancient trees guard their secrets. Whatever lives there, it doesn't want to be disturbed, and I have no intention of ever testing its patience again. Story title: The Night the River Screamed. There's a river deep within the heart of Wildwood Forest that few have seen and fewer still have survived to tell about. The locals call it the Screaming River, named for the unsettling wails that echo through the trees at night, carried on the wind like a mournful lament. For generations, people have avoided it, whispering about lost souls and ancient spirits that haunt the waters. But for me and my friends, it was an irresistible challenge. The idea came to us one evening over drinks. We were all seasoned adventurers, always looking for the next thrill, the next story to tell. When someone mentioned the Screaming River, it sparked a debate that ended with us planning a trip to find it. We laughed off the warnings, convinced that we'd return with nothing more than a good story and maybe some eerie photos to show off. Our group of 4, me, Tom, Jess, and Rachel, set out early one Saturday morning, armed with camping gear, maps, and a determination to find the river and prove the legends wrong. The hike into Wildwood Forest was grueling. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining above us, casting long shadows that made the forest floor seem darker than it should have been. The deeper we went, the more the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the dense forest and the growing sense of isolation. By late afternoon, we could hear the faint sound of rushing water, distant but distinct. It urged us onward, even as the daylight began to wane. The path, if you could call it that, was barely more than a narrow track through the underbrush, overgrown and treacherous. But finally we emerged into a clearing, and there it was, the Screaming River. The river was wider than we expected, its waters dark and fast-moving, frothing white where they crashed against the rocks. The air around it was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year, and the sound of the rushing water was almost deafening. We stood there, staring at the river that had been the subject of so many ghost stories, feeling a mix of awe and unease. We set up camp near the riverbank, a safe distance from the water, but close enough to hear its constant roar. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily quiet. The only sound was the rushing water, which seemed to grow louder with the approaching night. We built a fire, its flames dancing in the gathering darkness, and tried to shake off the growing sense of dread. But as night fully descended, something changed. The roar of the river took on a new quality, a high-pitched undertone that sent shivers down our spines. It was almost as if the water itself was crying out, a keening wail that echoed off the trees and carried far into the night. We exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said anything. We were too stubborn to admit that the stories might have been true. Then, as the fire crackled and popped, the screaming started. At first it was just a faint sound, like a distant cry carried on the wind. But it grew louder, more intense, until it seemed to be coming from all around us. The wails were inhuman, a mix of anger, pain, and sorrow that filled the air and vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. The river itself seemed to pulse with the sound, its waters churning more violently, as if reacting to the cries. Jess was the first to stand up, her face pale in the firelight. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." But before we could respond, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The river, which had been a constant, steady force, suddenly surged, its waters rising and crushing against the banks with a force that sent spray flying into the air. The wails grew louder, more desperate, filling the night with a cacophony of sound that was almost unbearable. We grabbed our gear, fumbling in the darkness as we tried to pack up as quickly as possible. But the screaming didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, the cries turning into shrieks that seemed to pierce through our very souls. The river was alive with movement now, the water swirling and frothing as if something beneath the surface was trying to break free. As we turned to leave, we saw them, figures standing in the water. At first, they were just shapes, dark and indistinct, but as our eyes adjusted, we realized they were human-like, their forms twisted and elongated, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. They stood in the water, their bodies half submerged, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The figures began to move, wading through the river with slow, deliberate steps. The water around them frothed and boiled, the screams growing louder with each step they took. We were paralyzed by fear, unable to look away as they moved closer to the shore, their eyes locked onto us with a malevolent intensity. Rachel screamed, snapping us out of our stupor. We turned and ran, the echoes of our footsteps swallowed by the wails that filled the night. The forest, which had seemed dense and impenetrable during the day, now felt like a labyrinth, the trees closing in around us as we stumbled through the underbrush. The figures from the river were behind us, their cries mixing with the sound of rushing water, their forms flickering in and out of sight like shadows dancing in the firelight. No matter how fast we ran, the screams seemed to follow us, growing louder, more frenzied, until it felt like they were inside our heads, vibrating through our very bones. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every breath felt like a struggle against the weight of the forest pressing in on us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst out of the trees and onto the dirt road where we had parked the car. We didn't stop running until we were inside, the doors slammed shut, the engine roaring to life as Tom floored the gas pedal. We sped away from the forest, the screams fading into the distance, but the terror remained, lodged deep within our chests. We never spoke about that night again. The screaming river became just another ghost story to us, a tale we couldn't bring ourselves to tell. Rachel moved away, trying to escape the memories, and Tom, Jess, and I drifted apart, each of us haunted in our own way by the things we saw, the things we heard. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the wind is just right, I can still hear the faint echo of those screams, carried on the breeze like a warning. And I know that the screaming river is still out there, hidden deep within Wildwood Forest, waiting for the next group of fools to come looking for it. And I hope they heed the warnings we ignored. Because some places are meant to be left alone, and some themes should never be disturbed. Story title: The Night the Wolves Howled. The Blackwood Forest had always been a place of mystery and fear. For as long as anyone could remember, the locals had spoken of the wolves that roamed the forest, their howls echoing through the trees on cold, moonless nights. But these weren't ordinary wolves, at least not according to the stories. They were said to be larger, smarter, and more cunning, with an almost supernatural intelligence. Some claimed they were spirits of the forest itself, others said they were cursed, but all agreed on one thing: no one who heard their howls ever returned from the forest. Naturally, these tales intrigued me and my friends. We were young, reckless, and eager to prove that we weren't afraid of some old legends. So, one cold winter's night, we decided to venture into Blackwood Forest. There were 5 of us: me, Mark, Lisa, Tony, and Sarah. We armed ourselves with flashlights, a couple of knives, and more bravado than sense, convinced that we'd be back by morning with nothing more than a few spooky stories to tell. We reached the edge of the forest just after sunset. The sky was clear, the air biting cold, and the snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way into the trees. The forest was dense, the towering pines blocking out what little light remained, and soon we were enveloped in darkness, the only sound the faint rustle of wind through the branches. The deeper we went, the more the world outside seemed to vanish, replaced by the still, eerie quiet of the forest. The stories had said that the wolves of Blackwood only appeared on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden and the forest was silent. We had chosen this night specifically because of that. It was a new moon, and the sky was pitch black, the perfect conditions for testing the legends. We walked for hours, the cold seeping into our bones, our flashlights casting long, wavering shadows on the snow-covered ground. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling began to settle over us. The forest was too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the sound of our footsteps crunching in the snow. It was Mark who first heard it, a faint, distant howl that sent a chill down our spines. We all stopped, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. We exchanged nervous glances, but none of us wanted to admit we were scared. After all, this was what we had come for, wasn't it? But as we started walking again, the howling returned, louder this time, closer. It wasn't like the howl of any wolf I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more resonant, and there was something almost human about it, a mournful, haunting quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We quickened our pace, not quite running, but not strolling either. The howling followed us, growing louder, more insistent, until it seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees. The shadows on the ground seemed to stretch and twist, taking on strange, almost menacing shapes in the dim light of our flashlights. Then suddenly, the howling stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, thick and oppressive, pressing down on us like a physical weight. We stopped, looking around, our breaths coming in quick, foggy puffs in the freezing air. But there was nothing, just the silent, snow-covered forest stretching out in all directions. We were about to start moving again when we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible crunching sound, like something heavy moving through the snow. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Something was out there, circling us, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. Our flashlights flicked back and forth, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but the beams only revealed more trees, more snow, and the dark, impenetrable night. The sound grew closer, and then, just at the edge of the light, we saw them, eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, low to the ground, and watching us with an unsettling, predatory intensity. The wolves. They were larger than any wolves I'd ever seen, their forms massive and hulking, with fur as dark as the night itself. Their eyes glowed with a cold, eerie light, and they moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. They were close now, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, circling us, their low growls rumbling through the night like distant thunder. We huddled together, backs to each other, trying to keep the wolves in sight, but it was impossible to track them all. They moved in and out of the shadows with an almost supernatural speed, their forms blurring in the darkness. The growling grew louder, more menacing, as they closed in, tightening the circle around us. Tony, always the bravest, or maybe the most foolish, shouted at the wolves, waving his flashlight at them in a desperate attempt to scare them off. For a moment, it seemed to work. The wolves hesitated, their growls faltering. But then, from somewhere deep in the forest, we heard a different sound, a low, deep howl that sent a shockwave of fear through us all. The wolves reacted instantly. They stopped growling, their heads snapping up as if listening to some silent command. And then, as one, they turned and melted back into the shadows, their glowing eyes disappearing into the darkness. For a brief, terrifying moment, the forest was silent again, and we thought it was over. But then, the ground beneath our feet began to shake. It was subtle at first, a faint trembling that we could have mistaken for the cold, but it quickly grew stronger, more violent, until the trees themselves seemed to be vibrating with the force of it. The howl came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees with a power that made the air hum. And then, from the darkness, we saw it. A massive, hulking shape moving toward us, its eyes glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. It was bigger than any wolf, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen, its form distorted and twisted, like something out of a nightmare. It let out a roar that shook the very ground we stood on, and that's when we broke. We ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we stumbled through the snow, the sound of our ragged breathing mixing with the terrifying growls and howls that seemed to follow us at every turn. The forest had become a maze, the trees closing in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes and skin as we tried to escape. The howling was everywhere now, echoing off the trees, growing louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself was alive with the sound. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing in the snow, gasping for breath. The howls were distant now, fading into the background as if the wolves had decided to let us go. But we knew better. We knew we had been lucky, that whatever was in those woods had decided to spare us this time. We found our way back to the car just as dawn was breaking, the pale light of morning filtering through the trees and chasing away the last remnants of the night.